The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped through my mail slot like a harbinger of doom. My name was typed across the front in block letters, Sarah Michelle Torres. Inside, legal documents that would shatter the carefully constructed peace I'd built over the past 5 years. Notice of civil lawsuit, screamed from the header in bold, unforgiving text. My hands trembled as I read the plaintiff's name, Margaret Elena Torres. My aunt, the woman who had taken me in when I was 12 years old after my parents died in that horrific car accident on Highway 101. The claim was for $50,000. $50,000 for child-rearing expenses, room and board, educational costs, and emotional labor provided to defendant from ages 12 to 18. I sank into my kitchen chair, the weight of betrayal crushing my chest. The coffee I'd been sipping turned bitter in my mouth. Outside my small apartment window, San Francisco's morning fog rolled in thick and gray, matching the storm brewing in my heart. Aunt Margaret was suing me for raising me. The woman who had stood at my parents' funeral, tears streaming down her face, promising she'd take care of me like you were my own daughter. The woman who had held me while I sobbed through nightmares, who had helped me pick out my prom dress, who had beamed with pride at my high school graduation. That woman was now demanding I pay her back for every meal, every roof over my head, every moment of care she'd given me during the most vulnerable years of my life. I scrolled through my phone and called my best friend Lisa, my voice barely a whisper when she answered. She's suing me, Liz. My own aunt is suing me for $50,000. What? Sarah, slow down. What are you talking about? Margaret. She says I owe her money for raising me. She has lawyers, Lisa. Real lawyers, with letterhead and everything. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Lisa's voice came through, tight with anger. That's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. You were a child. You lost your parents. She was your guardian. That was her legal responsibility. The papers say I have 30 days to respond, or she gets a default judgment. My voice cracked. I don't have $50,000. I barely have $500 in savings. You need a lawyer, Sarah. A good one. But lawyers cost money I didn't have. At 25, I was working as a junior graphic designer at a small firm, still paying off student loans, and trying to build a life in one of the most expensive cities in America. My modest apartment, my used Honda Civic, my carefully budgeted existence, none of it left room for legal fees. That evening, I sat in my living room staring at the lawsuit papers spread across my coffee table. The television droned in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything except the memories flooding back. I remembered the date. Margaret picked me up from the hospital after the accident. I was broken, literally and figuratively. My left arm was in a cast from the crash, and my heart was shattered into pieces smaller than the glass that had been swept from the highway. Margaret had been my father's older sister, unmarried, living alone in her pristine house in Mill Valley with its perfect garden and spotless white carpets. "You're going to live with me now," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "We're family. Family takes care of each other." For 6 years, I believed that was true. Margaret's house had rules, many rules. No shoes on the carpet, no eating anywhere but the kitchen, no friends over without permission, no noise after 8 p.m., no mess, no fuss, no trouble. I learned to move through that house like a ghost, grateful for the shelter, but always aware I was a guest who could never quite earn the right to truly belong. She'd reminded me often of my place. "I didn't have to take you in, you know," she'd say, when I'd accidentally track mud through the hallway, or forget to fold my laundry precisely the way she liked. "I could have let the state handle you. But family is family." Now I understood what family meant to Margaret Torres. It meant keeping receipts. I called in sick the next day and spent hours researching California family law, reading about guardianship responsibilities and the legal obligations of relatives who take in minor children. What I found gave me hope. Guardians are legally required to provide for their minor wards. Courts don't typically allow guardians to later bill their former wards for basic necessities. But hope didn't pay for legal representation. I swallowed my pride and called Margaret directly. The phone rang 4 times before her familiar voice answered. "Hello, Sarah. Aunt Margaret." The title felt foreign now, tainted. "I got your papers." "Good. I wasn't sure you'd received them yet." Her tone was businesslike, cold. This wasn't the woman who used to make me hot chocolate on school mornings or who taught me to drive in the empty parking lot behind the mall. I don't understand why you're doing this, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. It's quite simple, dear. I invested $50,000 in raising you. Food, clothing, shelter, private school tuition, extracurricular activities. I sacrificed my own comfort and finances to give you opportunities. Now that you're an adult with a good job, it's time you repaid that investment. I was 12 years old, Margaret. I was an orphan child. You were my responsibility, not my charity case. I kept careful records, Sarah, every expense, every sacrifice. My lawyer says I have an excellent case. The line went quiet, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I don't have $50,000, I whispered. Then perhaps you should have made better financial decisions. You have 30 days, Sarah. I suggest you figure something. Out the line went dead. I spent that night lying awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, and trying to understand how the woman who had been my refuge, after losing everything, could transform into someone I didn't recognize. The Margaret I remembered had her flaws. She was rigid, controlling, sometimes cold. But she had also been my stability in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. Or maybe this was who she'd always been, and I'd been too young and grateful to see it. Over the next week, I consulted with 3 different attorneys. The first wanted a $5,000 retainer I couldn't afford. The second took one look at the case and shook his head, explaining that while Margaret's claim was morally reprehensible, defending against it would still cost more than I could pay. The third lawyer, an older woman named Patricia Hernandez, listened to my story with growing indignation. "This is legal extortion," she said, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Your aunt is using the court system to abuse you all over again." "Can she win?" I asked. Patricia sighed. "California courts generally don't allow guardians to retroactively bill their wards for basic necessities. But if she can prove she went above and beyond what was legally required, expensive private schools, luxury items, extraordinary medical care, she might have grounds for partial recovery." "I went to public school," I said. "I wore clothes from Target. I don't understand what she's claiming. We'd need to see her documentation to know for sure. But Sarah, I have to be honest with you. Even if we can get this case dismissed, the legal fees will be substantial. I charge $300 an hour." I thanked Patricia and walked out of her office feeling more defeated than when I'd arrived. That evening, I called my college roommate Jenny and broke down completely. Between sobs, I told her everything: the lawsuit, the money I didn't have, the aunt who had turned into a stranger. "Come stay with me in Portland," Jenny urged. "Just until this blows over. You can find work here." "Running away won't make the lawsuit disappear," I replied. "Besides, I can't abandon the life I've built here." "That would mean she wins." "Then fight her. Don't let her do this to you." But fighting required resources I didn't have. I was David facing Goliath, and I couldn't afford a slingshot. The deadline loomed closer. 20 days, 15 days, 10 days. I stopped sleeping well. My work suffered. My boss, a kind woman named Rebecca, noticed my distraction and called me into her office. "Sarah, are you okay? You seem troubled lately." I hadn't planned to tell anyone at work about my situation, but Rebecca's genuine concern broke down my defenses. The whole story tumbled out: my parents' death, Margaret's guardianship, the lawsuit, my inability to afford legal representation. Rebecca listened without interruption, her expression growing more horrified with each detail. "That's unconscionable," she said when I finished. "Using the legal system to traumatize someone who's already been through so much trauma." "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I've never felt so helpless." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, then reached for her phone. "I'm calling my brother-in-law. He's a family law attorney. Maybe he can help." "Rebecca, I can't afford—" "Let me make the call first. We'll figure out the rest later." By the end of that day, I had an appointment with Daniel Kim, Rebecca's brother-in-law. His office was in a sleek downtown building, and I felt intimidated walking into the marble lobby wearing my best work clothes, which suddenly seemed shabby and inadequate. Daniel was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to my story with the same growing outrage I'd seen in Patricia Hernandez, but his approach was different. The first thing we need to do is file a response to prevent a default judgment, he said. Then we'll demand to see all of Margaret's documentation supporting her claim. About your fees, I began, but he held up a hand. Rebecca told me about your situation. I'm going to take this case pro bono. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I'm offering. What your aunt is doing is legal abuse, and lawyers have a responsibility to prevent that when we can. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Daniel worked quickly to file our response. Within days, we received Margaret's documentation, and what we found was shocking. Her evidence included receipts for her own clothing purchases, restaurant meals she'd eaten alone, home maintenance expenses that had nothing to do with my presence in her house, and even claims for emotional labor, calculated at an hourly rate. Most damaging of all, she'd claimed I had attended an expensive private school called St. Catherine's Academy, at a cost of $15,000 per year. The problem was that St. Catherine's Academy didn't exist. I had attended Lincoln High School, a perfectly good public school, throughout my time with Margaret. She's committed fraud, Daniel said, studying the documents. She submitted fabricated evidence to the court. How is that possible? Won't she get in trouble? Oh, she's going to get in trouble. Big trouble. But first, let's see how far she's willing to take this lie. Daniel filed a discovery motion demanding that Margaret produce original receipts, school records, and detailed documentation for every claimed expense. He also requested that she appear for a deposition, a formal interview under oath. Margaret's lawyer tried to delay the deposition, then tried to withdraw from the case entirely. When the court wouldn't allow the withdrawal without cause, Margaret was forced to appear and answer questions under oath. I wasn't present for the deposition, but Daniel called me afterward, with barely contained excitement in his voice. Sarah, you need to sit down. What happened? She perjured herself multiple times. When I asked her about St. Catherine's Academy, she doubled down on the lie. She provided fake addresses, fake faculty names, even a fake graduation certificate with your name on it. My mouth fell open. She created a fake school? Not just fake, completely fabricated. She spent weeks creating elaborate documentation for a school that never existed. But here's the beautiful part. She got greedy. She claimed you had learning disabilities that required special tutoring at a cost of $200 per hour for 4 years, $20,000 in tutoring fees. I never had any learning disabilities. I know. And when I asked her to name your tutors, she gave me names of people I was able to prove never existed. One of them was supposedly a child psychologist named Dr. Eleanor Whitman. Sarah, there's never been a licensed psychologist in California with that name. The room seemed to spin around me. She made up everything? Everything expensive, yes. The basic necessities, your share of groceries, utilities, clothing from Target. Those receipts were real, but they totaled less than $18,000 over 6 years. The other $32,000 she's claiming, complete fiction. What happens now? Now we crush her in court. The hearing was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning in November. I wore my one good suit, navy blue, purchased for job interviews, and arrived at the courthouse with Daniel and Rebecca, who had insisted on coming for moral support. Margaret was already there with her lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool weather. Margaret looked exactly as I remembered, perfectly coiffed gray hair, expensive handbag, that rigid posture that had intimidated me as a child. But now, knowing what she'd done, she just looked small and mean. She didn't meet my eyes. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She reviewed the case file while we waited, occasionally making notes or shaking her head slightly. "This is highly unusual," she said when she was ready to begin. "Mrs. Torres, you're claiming that your former ward owes you $50,000 for child-rearing expenses. Can you explain the legal basis for this claim?" Margaret's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client made extraordinary financial sacrifices to provide premium care and education for the defendant, going far beyond what was required by law. She seeks only reasonable reimbursement for these excessive expenses." "I see." Judge Morrison flipped through the documents. "And you claim the defendant attended a private school called St. Catherine's Academy at a cost of $15,000 per year?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Mr. Kim, does your client dispute attending this school?" Daniel stood. "She absolutely disputes it, Your Honor. Because St. Catherine's Academy doesn't exist, never has existed. Ms. Torres attended Lincoln High School, which is a public school. The courtroom fell silent. I watched Margaret's face go pale. Your Honor, her lawyer sputtered, we have documentation. Fraudulent documentation, Daniel interrupted. Your Honor, we'd like to call Margaret Torres to the witness stand. What followed was the most devastating cross-examination I'd ever witnessed. Daniel methodically dismantled every false claim, every fabricated receipt, every imaginary expense. He had done his homework thoroughly, contacting schools, businesses, and service providers to verify that Margaret's claimed expenses were impossible. When he asked Margaret to explain how she'd obtained report cards from a school that didn't exist, she claimed she must have made an error in her record keeping. When he showed her that the tutor she'd claimed to hire had never been licensed in California, she said she might have been confused about the name. When he presented evidence that Dr. Eleanor Whitman, the psychologist she claimed had treated me, was a fictional character from a romance novel, Margaret sat in stunned silence for a full minute before whispering, "I don't understand." But the most damaging moment came when Daniel asked a simple question. "Mrs. Torres, did you love Sarah when she came to live with you?" Margaret's composure cracked completely. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Did you love her? I fulfilled my legal obligations. That's not what I asked. I asked if you loved her. This 12-year-old girl who had just lost both her parents in a tragic accident. Did you love her? Margaret looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. I saw something flicker in her eyes. Regret, maybe, or recognition of what she'd lost. "I took care of her," she said finally. "For 6 years, you kept receipts of every penny you spent on a grieving child, planning someday to bill her for being an orphan. Does that sound like love to you, Mrs. Torres?" Margaret didn't answer. Judge Morrison had heard enough. "Mrs. Torres, please step down. Mrs. Torres, your attorney, please approach the bench." What followed was a whispered conversation between the judge and Margaret's lawyer that lasted several minutes. When they returned, the lawyer's face was ashen. "Your Honor," he said, "my client would like to withdraw her lawsuit." "I'm sure she would," Judge Morrison replied dryly. "Unfortunately, this matter has progressed beyond simple withdrawal. Mrs. Torres, you have committed perjury in my courtroom. You have submitted fraudulent documents as evidence. You have wasted this court's time and resources pursuing a frivolous and malicious lawsuit against a young woman whose only crime was being orphaned and placed in your care." Margaret was shaking now, her perfect composure completely shattered. "I am dismissing this lawsuit with prejudice and awarding attorney's fees to the defendant. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution for perjury and fraud. Mrs. Torres, you should consider yourself fortunate that I don't hold you in contempt of court right now." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Margaret's lawyer immediately began pleading for mercy, explaining that his client was elderly, had no criminal record, was suffering from stress. Judge Morrison listened with barely concealed disgust. "Your client systematically fabricated evidence to steal money from someone she was legally and morally obligated to protect. She traumatized a young woman who had already suffered tremendous loss. The fact that she's elderly doesn't make her crimes less heinous. It makes them worse." The judge awarded me $12,000 in attorney's fees and costs, though Daniel had assured me he wouldn't collect on his pro bono work. More importantly, she issued a restraining order prohibiting Margaret from contacting me directly or indirectly. As we left the courthouse, Margaret tried to approach me in the hallway. The bailiff stopped her, reminding her of the restraining order, but she called out anyway, "Sarah, I never meant, I was just trying to—" I turned to face her one last time. This woman who had shaped my adolescence, who had been my guardian and my shelter and ultimately my tormentor. She looked older now, smaller, broken by the consequence of her own greed and cruelty. "You kept receipts," I said quietly. "For 6 years, you kept receipts on a child who had lost everything. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." I walked away and never looked back. The local news picked up the story within days. Woman sues orphaned niece for cost of raising her became a viral sensation, shared thousands of times on social media. The comments were universally supportive of me and scathing toward Margaret. Her neighbors, her former co-workers, people who had known her for decades, were reading about what she'd done. Margaret Torres, who had always been so concerned about appearances and reputation, found herself the subject of public scorn and ridicule. 3 weeks after the hearing, Daniel called to tell me that the district attorney's office was moving forward with fraud charges against Margaret. She was facing potential jail time and substantial fines. But the real karma came in ways I never could have anticipated. Rebecca told me that Margaret had been forced to hire a criminal defense attorney, draining her savings account. The stress of the criminal charges and public humiliation had caused her to lose weight, lose sleep, and alienate the few friends she'd had left. More significantly, the publicity around the case had attracted the attention of other people Margaret had wronged. Over the years, her former neighbors came forward with stories of her filing frivolous lawsuits against them for minor property disputes. Her former employees revealed a pattern of wage theft and harassment. The woman who had painted herself as a pillar of the community was exposed as a serial abuser of anyone she perceived as vulnerable. Most poetically, Margaret's own elderly mother, my grandmother, whom I'd never been allowed to have a relationship with, reached out to me through a mutual family friend. She was 92 years old and living in assisted care, and she wanted to apologize for her daughter's behavior. Margaret always was a selfish child, my grandmother told me when we finally met for coffee 6 months after the trial. But what she did to you, I never raised her to be cruel. Through my grandmother, I learned that Margaret had always been jealous of my father, her younger brother. He'd been the successful one, the beloved one, the one who had everything she'd wanted but never achieved. When he died, she'd seen taking me in, not as an act of love, but as an opportunity to claim some of what had been his. And when I grew up and built a life for myself, modest though it was, she'd resented my independence and success. The lawsuit wasn't really about money. It was about control. It was about punishing me for daring to thrive despite her best efforts to keep me small and grateful. She could have loved you, my grandmother said, tears in her faded blue eyes. You were such a sweet child. She could have had a daughter who adored her, a relationship that would have enriched both your lives. Instead, she chose bitterness and greed. Now she has nothing. Margaret's criminal trial took place 8 months later. I wasn't required to testify, but I attended as an observer. She pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and perjury, accepting a plea bargain that gave her probation, community service, and restitution payments. The woman who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating looked frail and defeated standing before the judge. Her lawyer explained that she was in therapy, that she was remorseful, that she understood the harm she'd caused. The judge wasn't impressed. Mrs. Torres, you targeted someone you should have protected. You used the legal system as a weapon against a young woman whose only vulnerability was having trusted you. Your actions represent the worst kind of betrayal, the betrayal of family, of responsibility, and of the basic human decency we owe to those who depend on us. Margaret was ordered to pay $15,000 in fines and court costs, and to perform 500 hours of community service. She was also required to undergo psychological counseling and was permanently prohibited from filing any legal actions against me. But the real justice wasn't dispensed by any court. It came from the natural consequences of her choices, the way lies and cruelty ultimately consume the people who practice them. Margaret Torres spent years building a reputation as a respectable, upstanding citizen. In a matter of weeks, she destroyed it completely through her own greed and dishonesty. She lost her standing in her community, her relationships with neighbors and acquaintances, and ultimately her own self-respect. The money she'd hoped to steal from me ended up costing her far more than she'd ever dreamed. Legal fees, fines, and the reputation damage that affected her ability to find work in her later years left her financially devastated. Most importantly, she lost any chance of having a meaningful relationship with me. I had been prepared to forgive her controlling behavior, her emotional coldness, even her lack of maternal warmth. I understood that she'd never asked to be guardian to a grieving adolescent. But her decision to turn my childhood trauma into a business opportunity revealed something so fundamentally broken in her character that reconciliation became impossible. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from Margaret. It had been forwarded through Daniel's office in compliance with the restraining order. She was asking for forgiveness, claiming to understand now how wrong she'd been, begging for a chance to repair our relationship. I read the letter once and then threw it away. Some wounds are too deep to heal, And some betrayals are too profound to forgive. Margaret had made her choice when she decided to keep receipts on an orphan child. She'd chosen money over love, control over compassion, cruelty over kindness. Now she would live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. Today, I'm 30 years old. I've been promoted twice at my firm and recently bought my first house, a small cottage with a garden where I'm learning to grow flowers and vegetables. I'm engaged to a wonderful man who knows my whole story and loves me anyway. We're planning a wedding for next spring. Sometimes people ask me if I'm bitter about what Margaret did, if I'm angry about the years I lost feeling grateful to someone who saw my presence in her life as a debt to be collected. The honest answer is that I was angry for a long time. I was furious at her betrayal, devastated by her cruelty, and traumatized all over again by her willingness to exploit my childhood grief for financial gain. But anger is a poison that hurts the person carrying it more than the person it's directed toward. Margaret Torres doesn't deserve the gift of my continued rage. She doesn't deserve to live rent-free in my head or to taint my happiness with her bitterness. What happened to Margaret wasn't revenge, it was karma. She created her own downfall through her choices, her lies, her fundamental inability to see me as anything more than a burden with a price tag. The universe has a way of balancing the scales, and Margaret Torres learned that lesson the hard way. She taught me something valuable, though she never meant to, that the way people treat others in their most vulnerable moments reveals everything about who they really are. She had the opportunity to be a hero in my story, to be the aunt who saved me and loved me and helped me heal from tremendous loss. Instead, she chose to be the villain. And like all good villains, she was ultimately defeated not by the hero's sword, but by the poison of her own making. I've built a good life in spite of her, not because of her. I've learned to love and be loved, to trust and be trusted, to give and receive kindness without keeping score. I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choice, about showing up, about caring for each other without expecting payment in return. Margaret Torres kept receipts on love and discovered that love doesn't work that way. Real love, the kind that heals and nurtures and builds people up, is given freely, without expectation of return, without strings or conditions or IOUs. She could have learned that lesson by practicing it. Instead, she learned it by losing everything she might have had if she'd been capable of genuine human connection. That's karma. That's justice. And that's the end of Margaret Torres's power over my story. I'm the author of my own life now, and it's a story of resilience, hope, and the triumph of dignity over cruelty. Margaret Torres is just a chapter I've moved past, a lesson learned, a reminder that some people reveal their true nature only when they think no one is watching. The universe was watching, and the universe has a very long memory. Justice, it turns out, is patient, but it's also inevitable. Margaret Torres sued me for $50,000 and ended up losing everything that mattered. She taught me that keeping receipts on love is a fool's game, and in the end, she got exactly what she deserved. A life as empty and transactional as the relationships she chose to cultivate. And I got something far more valuable than money. The knowledge that I survived her, outlasted her cruelty, and built something beautiful in spite of everything she tried to take from me. That's a victory no court could have awarded me, and no amount of money could have bought. In the end, karma didn't need my help. It just needed time.